There is a name that does not belong to any single era of the galaxy's long and troubled memory, a name that does not fit cleanly into the records of any one republic or empire or age of reckoning, and yet appears across the entire sweep of the oldest traditions like a wound that never fully closes, visible at certain angles in the chronicles of the Jedi, in the philosophical treatises of the ancient orders, in the fragmentary accounts preserved on worlds so remote and so forgotten, that the civilizations which once housed them have left behind nothing but dust and the faint residual impression of a darkness that passed through and did not entirely depart. The name is the Sith, and tonight we are going to follow it back to its very source, to the moment before it was a name at all, to a time when the beings who would eventually carry it existed in a condition of unmarked potential. Creatures of extraordinary sensitivity and extraordinary pride, who had not yet made the choices that would transform them from students of the Force into something the galaxy had never previously had a word for. So settle in now, and allow the day to release its hold on you, and let the world you know soften at its edges and give way, slowly and without insistence, to an older world, one that existed so far before the conflicts most people associate with that name that it requires a particular quality of stillness to perceive it clearly, a willingness to set aside what you think you already know and receive, instead what the oldest records actually say. The story we are entering tonight is vast in the way that only origin stories are truly vast, not merely long but foundational, not merely old but generative of everything that came after it. The kind of history whose understanding changes the meaning of every subsequent event it preceded. It begins not with war and not with the familiar red of lightsabers drawn in darkness, but in the light of an ancient academy, on a world whose name has been repeated so many times across so many thousands of years that the repetition itself has become a kind of prayer, a locating word, a way of saying this is where something essential about the galaxy's relationship to power and philosophy and the deepest nature of the Force began. It begins on Tython, and it begins in a moment of peace that was already, in the way that all significant peacetimes already contain within them the seeds of what will end them, carrying within its own structure the tensions that would eventually tear it apart. Let the breath slow. Let the shoulders settle. We're going a very long way back tonight, and the journey is most clearly made from a place of quiet. Before there was a Sith order, before there was a name for the philosophy that would eventually fracture the Force-using traditions of the galaxy and send them into a war whose reverberations are still felt in the very structure of institutions that came to exist thousands of years later, there was a world of deep green forests and high thin air, and the particular quality of Force resonance that the oldest accounts describe with a consistency suggesting they were drawing on genuine memory rather than retrospective mythology. Tython was among the earliest worlds where beings sensitive to the Force gathered with intentional purpose, not merely individuals who had discovered their sensitivity and sought to understand it in isolation, but communities of such individuals drawn together by the shared recognition that what they could perceive and what they could touch within the invisible architecture of living energy that connected all things was too significant and too complex to be approached alone, too much the property of the galaxy's deepest mystery to be held by any single mind without the discipline and the companionship and the corrective pressure of others who understood what they were reaching toward. The traditions that eventually became the Jedi Order were not born fully formed, were not the product of a single founding moment or a single founding philosophy descending into the world complete. They were the accumulated result of centuries of argument, of deep disagreement about fundamental questions that the Force itself seemed to hold open rather than close, questions about the nature of emotion and its relationship to perception, about whether the dark and the light that every practitioner could feel within the Force were moral categories, or simply descriptive ones, about whether the deepest understanding of the Force required the practitioner to transcend their own nature or to fully inhabit it, and about who, among those who could touch the Force, had the authority and the wisdom to determine the answers to these questions for everyone else. These were not abstract disagreements. They were the kind of philosophical disagreements that become, when pursued with sufficient intensity by beings of sufficient capability and sufficient pride, the preconditions of catastrophe. Among those early communities, the people who would eventually be known as the Jedi, a term from the ancient Dai Bendu traditions meaning something close to mystic center in its original formulation, a designation for those who sought to stand in the balance between the two currents of Force energy, that the oldest practitioners described as Ashlar and Bogan, the light and the dark in their most primary and most elemental expressions. These early Force users had developed around the concept of balance, a philosophy of remarkable sophistication. They understood, or believed they understood, that the Force was not simply a power to be wielded, but a living relationship to be maintained. That the practitioner who pursued the light to the complete exclusion of the dark, and the practitioner who pursued the dark to the complete exclusion of the light, were both making the same fundamental error, which was the error of choosing a part and mistaking it for the whole, of reducing the infinite complexity of the Force to the portion of it that confirmed what they already wanted to believe about the nature of things. This philosophy had within it, as all philosophies of genuine sophistication have within them, a built-in tension that its most rigorous thinkers could not entirely resolve, and that the less rigorous among its adherents often resolved prematurely in ways that made the philosophy easier to practice, but less honest about what practicing it actually required. The tension was this: if the dark and the light were both legitimate expressions of the Force's nature, if balance between them was the truest form of understanding, then what distinguished a practitioner who had genuinely achieved balance from one who had simply given themselves permission to pursue darkness by wrapping that pursuit in the language of philosophical equilibrium? The Jedi teachers who wrestled most honestly with this question understood that the answer required more than intellectual discipline, required more than the correct verbal formulation of one's position in relation to the Force's dual nature. It required a quality of self-knowledge so complete and so unflinching that very few beings of any era or any tradition have ever genuinely possessed it, and that the absence of it, in beings of great capability and great ambition, tends to produce outcomes of great consequence. It was into this tradition, with its genuine wisdom and its genuine unresolved tensions, that the beings who would eventually become the first Sith were born and trained and shaped by the practice of an ancient and demanding discipline. They were not, in those earliest years, a separate people or a separate order. They were Jedi, or the predecessors of Jedi, practitioners of the same traditions and inhabitants of the same communities and students of the same masters, distinguished from their contemporaries not by a fundamental difference in what they believed about the Force, but by the particular intensity of their engagement with certain aspects of it, by the specific quality of their relationship to emotion and passion, and the form of Force perception that those states of intense feeling could amplify. They could feel things in the Force that their more composed contemporaries could not easily access. They could reach into currents of energy that required, for their activation, a willingness to inhabit emotional extremity rather than rise above it, and what they found there was real, was genuinely powerful, was not the mere self-delusion of people who had convinced themselves that transgression was insight. The accounts preserved from this period, fragmented and imperfect as they are, drawing on sources whose chain of transmission across the vast span of time between their composition and the present is necessarily incomplete, are consistent on one point that deserves particular attention before we proceed further. The beings who would become the first Sith were not, in the moment of their earliest development, morally simple. They were not villains who had always been villains, not darkness that had always been dark, not the embodiment of a philosophy that had been chosen with the full consciousness of what the choice entailed and accepted with clear-eyed willingness. They were, in those first centuries on Tython and the world surrounding it, people of genuine gifts and genuine insights and genuine contributions to the understanding of the Force, people whose approach to the living energy that suffused all things had produced real wisdom alongside the dangers it also produced, and whose eventual separation from the mainstream of what the Jedi tradition would become was the culmination not of a single dramatic betrayal, but of a long accumulation of smaller divergences, each of which felt, in the moment of its occurrence, like a natural extension of what had come immediately before. This is the particular tragedy of the Sith origin, and it is a tragedy worth dwelling in rather than moving through quickly, because it is the quality of the story that distinguishes it from a simple account of evil arising from nowhere for no reason, which is the version of the story that requires the least of its listener and also teaches the least. The Force, in all the traditions that have preserved serious and sustained thinking about its nature, does not produce evil as a simple given. It produces beings of extraordinary sensitivity to the full spectrum of what exists within living energy, and those beings make choices over time within the specific context of their lives and their training and the communities they inhabit, and the choices accumulate into character, and the character eventually expresses itself in action, and the action has consequences that extend far beyond the individual who initiated them, consequences that reshape the galaxy and persist across centuries and millennia in the form of institutions and philosophies and conflicts whose participants may not even know the name of the person whose original choice set the whole chain in motion. The philosophical tensions that had been present within the Jedi tradition from its earliest centuries did not remain tensions indefinitely, which is the nature of tensions held within communities of beings whose capabilities exceed their patience and whose pride, however genuinely earned, makes the sustained acknowledgement of unresolved questions feel, over time, less like intellectual honesty and more like institutional failure. The disagreement that had always existed between those who believed the Force was best understood through the cultivation of inner stillness and those who believed it was best understood through the full and unreserved embrace of emotional intensity had been managed across the long generations of the Jedi academies on Tython. Through a combination of philosophical accommodation and the kind of practical tolerance that communities extend to internal disagreement, when the disagreement has not yet produced consequences serious enough to make tolerance feel like complicity. That management was always provisional. The accommodation was always temporary, and the event that ended it arrived not as a single, dramatic rupture, but as the gradual intensification of something that had been building for so long that when it finally broke the surface it felt to those experiencing it less like a new crisis than like the belated acknowledgement of a crisis that had always been present beneath the surface of everything they had been doing. What the oldest accounts call the Force Wars, the great conflict that tore the Jedi tradition apart across the period that scholars of this era designate as approximately 25,000 years before the founding of the Galactic Republic, was not, in its origins, a war at all. It was a schism, which is a different kind of rupture, and in many ways a more consequential one, because schisms do not arise from the simple collision of opposing forces, but from the gradual discovery, within a community that had believed itself unified by shared purpose, that the shared purpose had never been as shared as the community's self-understanding required it to be. The practitioners who had always been drawn most powerfully toward what the Jedi called Bogan, the dark current of the Force, the aspect of it that spoke in the language of passion and hunger, and the particular form of clarity that comes not from the quieting of desire but from its complete and unashamed expression, had reached a point in their development at which the balancing philosophy that the Jedi tradition formerly required was no longer something they could inhabit without a dishonesty that their most fundamental instincts refused to sustain. Among those practitioners, the traditions preserve certain names with a consistency that suggests these figures were understood, even in their own time, as representing something more than individual dissent, as embodying in their personal choices a position that many others shared but had not yet found a voice capable of expressing, with a combination of intellectual rigour and emotional force that genuine philosophical leadership requires. One name appears with particular frequency in the accounts of this period, a name belonging to a practitioner whose gifts were described by contemporaries as exceeding those of any Force user of their generation, and whose particular quality of engagement with the dark current of the Force had produced insights that even those who opposed the direction those insights led could not simply dismiss as the self-justification of an undisciplined mind. The name was Xendor, and the tradition's treatment of Xendor is instructive about the honesty of the sources that preserved it, because it does not reduce him to a simple antagonist, does not flatten the complexity of what he represented into the kind of clean moral opposition that makes history easier to teach and harder to understand. Xendor had trained at the Jedi Academy on Tython, with a dedication that his masters acknowledged was exceptional, even among a community in which exceptional dedication was the baseline expectation, had moved through the disciplines of Force perception and Force manipulation with a thoroughness that left in his wake a record of achievement that the academies used as a standard of comparison for subsequent students for generations after his departure. He was not a rebel by temperament, not a being whose instinct was toward the transgressive for its own sake, not someone who pursued the dark current of the Force because darkness held for him the appeal of the forbidden, the particular glamour that transgression acquires for those whose real motivation is the attention that transgression attracts. His engagement with the dark was philosophical, systematic, and genuinely productive, in the sense that the understanding he developed through it was real understanding, that the things he learned about the Force, through his willingness to inhabit emotional intensity and passion, and the specific form of clarity that those states provided, were things that the more composed and more balanced practitioners of his community could not as easily access, and could not simply dismiss as illusory once he had articulated them with sufficient precision to demand serious engagement. The break, when it came, was precipitated not by a single event, but by the accumulation of smaller confrontations, each of which left the distance between Xendor's position and the mainstream of Jedi teaching slightly wider than it had been before, each of which made the next confrontation slightly more charged with the weight of everything that had preceded it. The Jedi Council, the body of senior practitioners who governed the Order's philosophical direction and maintained the standards of its academies, had been watching the development of what they understood as a faction within their community with the combination of genuine concern and institutional uncertainty that organizations feel when a challenge to their authority comes not from simple wrong-headedness, but from a position that contains enough genuine insight to make the challenge difficult to simply overrule. They could not easily say that Xendor and those who shared his orientation were wrong about the dark current's capacity to illuminate aspects of the Force that the balanced approach sometimes obscured. What they could say, and what their most serious thinkers did say, was that the path Xendor was following had no natural stopping point, had no mechanism within itself for limiting how far the pursuit of passion and power could go before it consumed everything else that had made the practitioner valuable and left in its place only the appetite. This was the argument, and it was a serious argument, and it was also an argument that Xendor and his allies had heard and considered, and had responses to that were not obviously inadequate. Which is precisely the kind of situation that makes philosophical disagreements within communities of capable and committed people so difficult to resolve through the ordinary mechanisms of persuasion and institutional authority. They were not wrong about the dark current. They were not wrong that it offered access to dimensions of Force perception that the balanced approach was less equipped to reach. What they were resistant to acknowledging, and what the tragedy of their subsequent history suggests they were never fully able to acknowledge, was that the capability the dark current provided and the wisdom required to use that capability in service of something beyond the immediate satisfaction of the one who possessed it were not the same thing, and that the philosophical framework they were developing to justify the pursuit of the first did not adequately address the absence of the second. The schism formalized itself in the period that the oldest accounts describe simply as the Great Departure, the moment at which Xendor and a significant number of practitioners who had aligned themselves with his philosophical position left the Jedi academies on Tython and established themselves in the outer reaches of the Tython system and eventually beyond it, in communities oriented entirely around the dark current's exploration and the development of a practice unencumbered by the balancing requirements that the Jedi mainstream had always insisted upon. They did not, in this initial departure, call themselves Sith. That name would come later, attached to them by a history that the moment of departure had not yet produced. They were simply practitioners who had concluded that the institution they had trained within was not capable of giving them what they most deeply needed, and who had chosen the only alternative their situation appeared to offer, which was to build something that could. The building of something is always, in the moment of its beginning, an act that feels like creation rather than destruction, like the opening of possibility rather than the closing of it, and the practitioners who left Tython in that period were not, in their own experience of the departure, abandoning something good. They were, as they understood it, finally moving towards something better. The Force wars that followed the schism's formalization were the consequence of two communities of extraordinarily capable beings attempting to occupy the same galaxy, with philosophies that each considered foundational and neither considered negotiable, and they deserve the particular quality of attention that the tradition's oldest accounts give them, which is the attention of witnesses who understand that what they are describing is not simply a conflict between the right and the wrong, but a collision between two genuine understandings of the Force that had been developing side by side within the same tradition until the side by side became untenable, and the only available alternatives were separation or confrontation. The confrontation came, as confrontations between such forces always come, not because either side had decided that confrontation was the best available option, but because the accumulation of smaller frictions and smaller territorial pressures and smaller assertions of incompatible claims had reached the point where the absence of direct confrontation required a degree of mutual accommodation that neither side was any longer willing to extend. The Jedi who remained committed to the balanced philosophy fought to preserve the tradition they had built and the worlds they had built it on. The practitioners who had followed Xendor's path fought for the right to pursue the Force without the constraints that the balanced tradition imposed, and the fighting was, as fighting between Force users of the highest capability tends to be, of a quality and an intensity whose description the oldest accounts handle with the particular restraint of people who understood that elaboration would not add to understanding and might simply produce in their listeners a kind of numbing rather than the genuine comprehension they were trying to provide. What the Force Wars produced in their eventual resolution was not the clean victory of one philosophy over another, but something considerably more complex and more consequential for the long future of the galaxy's relationship to the Force. The Jedi tradition, shaped by the experience of what the unrestrained pursuit of the dark current had produced in the conflict, moved in the war's aftermath toward a position that was considerably less accommodating of the dark than the balanced philosophy it had previously maintained, moved toward the understanding that the light side of the Force was not simply one pole of a necessary balance, but the proper orientation of any practice that sought genuine wisdom rather than the mere accumulation of power. This movement was understandable, was in many ways the natural response of a tradition that had witnessed what the unrestrained dark could do, and had arrived at the reasonable conclusion that the distance between balance and darkness was too small and too easily crossed to be relied upon as a safeguard. It was also, in ways that would take thousands of years to fully express themselves, a loss as well as a gain, an exchange of one form of vulnerability for another, the vulnerability of the balanced philosophy's too easy slide into darkness, traded for the vulnerability of a practice that had severed itself from one half of the Force's nature, and would spend the rest of its history managing the consequences of that severance. The practitioners who had followed Xendor's path emerged from the Force Wars diminished in numbers and dispersed across the outer reaches of the galaxy's explored regions, carrying with them the philosophical inheritance of everything that the schism and the conflict had taught them about what they were and what they were capable of, and what the galaxy's mainstream Force traditions were prepared to do to prevent them from practicing freely. They carried also the beginnings of something that the conflict had forged in them in the way that intense adversity forges character, a shared identity built not from the positive content of the philosophy they had chosen together, but from the shared experience of having been opposed together, of having fought together for the right to practice what they believed, and having lost that fight, at least in terms of the territory, and the institutional recognition the loss entailed. That shared identity was not yet the Sith. It was the precondition of the Sith, the emotional and philosophical raw material from which the Sith identity would eventually be constructed when the history of the next great exile gave it the specific shape and the specific name that the galaxy would carry forward into every subsequent age of its long and complicated memory. The dispersal that followed the Force Wars did not produce, in its immediate aftermath, the kind of clean historical break that subsequent traditions sometimes imposed upon it in their retelling, the satisfying division between a before and an after that makes the shape of events easier to comprehend but less honest about the actual texture of how things change over time. The practitioners who had followed Xendor's path into the conflict and survived its conclusion were not, in those first generations of their post-war existence, a unified people moving with shared purpose toward a common destination. They were scattered, in the way that defeated communities are always scattered, across worlds and systems that had offered refuge during the fighting, or simply represented the place where the fighting had ended, and forward movement had become impossible, carrying with them the philosophical inheritance of everything that had brought them to this point, and the practical challenge of sustaining that inheritance in conditions that had not been designed for its sustenance. They practiced in isolation and in small groups. They preserved what they could of the understanding they had developed. They passed their knowledge to students when students could be found. And the transmission was imperfect in the way that all transmissions across dispersal and difficulty are imperfect, losing precision at certain points and gaining, at other points, the particular kind of depth that comes from ideas tested by adversity, rather than simply maintained within the protected environment of an institution built specifically to maintain them. What they did not do, in those centuries of dispersal, was forget. This is perhaps the most significant fact about the period between the Force Wars and the event that would eventually crystallize their scattered identity into something coherent and named, the fact that the philosophical and emotional inheritance of what they had been and what they had fought for and what they had lost persisted across the generations with a consistency that suggests it was not merely transmitted as doctrine, but was felt as experience. As the living wound of a community that had been judged and found unacceptable by the tradition that had trained them and had spent the years since that judgment in a condition of unresolved grief and unresolved anger that gave their ongoing practice a quality of intensity that the settled and institutionalized Jedi mainstream, moving in its own direction toward what would eventually become the Jedi Order, could not quite replicate. The dark current of the Force, which they had always understood as the source of their deepest capability, was also, in this period, the medium through which that grief and that anger expressed themselves in Force terms, reinforcing and deepening the emotional orientation toward passion and power that had always distinguished their practice from the one they had departed. It was in this condition, dispersed and carrying the accumulated weight of generations of displacement, that the people who had become the Sith encountered the world that would give them their name and their shape, and the specific philosophical elaboration that transformed a scattered community of Force practitioners with a shared history of exile into something that the galaxy would eventually learn to regard as a distinct and formidable tradition in its own right. The world was called Korriban, and its discovery by the exiled practitioners, or rather their arrival upon it since the world had inhabitants already, inhabitants whose own history and whose own relationship to the Force made the encounter between them and the exiles one of the most consequential meetings in the history of the galaxy's Force traditions, was not the result of deliberate navigation toward a known destination. It was the result of the particular way that the Force moves significant things into contact with each other when the conditions are right, when the specific qualities of what is moving and the specific qualities of what it is moving toward are sufficiently complementary that the meeting, however it appears from the outside as accident or coincidence, carries within it the weight of something that was always going to happen once the elements involved existed in the same galaxy. Korriban was a world of red stone and ancient valleys, and a sky whose perpetual amber quality gave everything beneath it the particular appearance of things seen through a lens that had been coloured by the planet's own deep history. A history of Force sensitivity so concentrated and so old that the world itself seemed to participate in the dark current that ran through it, seemed to amplify and reflect back the Force energy of those who walked its surfaces in the way that certain materials amplify sound, taking what enters them and returning it transformed, larger and more resonant than it arrived. The world had been inhabited for as long as any of its records reached, inhabited by a people whose relationship to the Force was not the cultivated and philosophically elaborated relationship of the Jedi academies, but something older and more instinctive, a spiritual tradition that had grown organically from the world's natural Force saturation, and that expressed itself in practices of ancestor veneration and elemental attunement, and the particular form of Force sensitivity that arises in beings who have lived for many generations in an environment where the Force is not a discipline to be studied, but a constant of existence to be navigated. These were the Sith people, the original bearers of a name that the galaxy would eventually apply to a philosophy and an order whose connection to its original bearers would become, across the centuries, increasingly attenuated and increasingly complicated. The Sith species were beings of striking appearance and considerable native Force sensitivity, red-skinned and marked by the particular physical characteristics that their world's ancient Force saturation had shaped across the long millennia of their development, possessing in their biology a connection to the Force that was different in quality from anything the exiled practitioners from the Jedi tradition had previously encountered, more visceral and more immediate, less mediated by the philosophical frameworks that the academic traditions inevitably imposed upon their practitioners' experience of Force perception. They had their own hierarchy, their own traditions of Force use, their own understanding of the relationship between the living energy that suffused their world and the beings who inhabited it, and their own ways of marking and maintaining the distinctions between those among them whose Force sensitivity was most powerful and those whose gifts, while real, were of a more ordinary order. They were not a simple people, not the kind of civilization that a more technologically sophisticated encounter partner could regard as a blank surface upon which to inscribe their own ideas without resistance. They had depth, and the depth was genuine, and the exiled practitioners who arrived on their world were perceptive enough, most of them, to recognize it. The encounter between the exiled Force practitioners and the Sith people did not proceed according to any single pattern, did not resolve itself quickly into the kind of clear hierarchical arrangement that later accounts sometimes retrospectively imposed upon it. It was gradual and complicated and involved, on both sides, a sustained process of assessment and accommodation, and the particular kind of mutual recognition that occurs when beings of genuine capability encounter other beings of genuine capability and must negotiate. Through a process that is never entirely free of the power differentials that capability creates, what their relationship to each other is going to be, the exiles brought with them knowledge of the galaxy beyond Korriban, understanding of force techniques that the Sith species' own tradition had not developed, technological capabilities that the relatively isolated Sith civilization had not acquired, and the specific philosophical framework that their centuries of practice and conflict and exile had refined into something considerably more systematized than the organic spiritual tradition of the people they had arrived among. The Sith people brought with them the deep knowledge of their world and their world's particular force character, the instinctive force sensitivity that their bloodline had developed across generations of living in one of the galaxy's most force-saturated environments, and the specific techniques of force use that their tradition had cultivated, techniques that worked with the dark current in ways that were different from anything the exiles had developed, and that offered, to practitioners who understood what they were encountering, a genuine expansion of what was possible. What developed from this encounter, across the generations that followed, was something that neither party could have anticipated from the perspective of the arrival, a synthesis whose depth and whose eventual consequences exceeded what either the exiled practitioners' philosophical inheritance or the Sith people's organic tradition could have produced independently. The exiles, who were Jedi by training if not by current affiliation, brought to the synthesis the systematic rigor of the Jedi academic tradition, the habit of treating force perception as something that could be analysed and categorised and transmitted through deliberate instruction, rather than simply lived in and absorbed through proximity to a force-saturated environment. The Sith people brought the raw power of a force tradition that had never been mediated by the restraining influence of a balanced philosophy, that had always expressed itself most fully in the extremes of passion and hunger and the particular form of force use that those states made available. The combination produced, slowly and without any single moment of deliberate invention, the specific philosophical and practical tradition that would eventually carry the Sith name into every subsequent age of the galaxy's history. The deepening of this synthesis was accelerated by a process that the accounts of this period describe, with a consistency suggesting it was among the most significant developments of the early Korriban centuries, the process by which the exiled practitioners and the Sith people gradually intertwined not merely philosophically and practically, but genetically, producing across the generations a population that carried in its bloodline both the specific force sensitivity of the Sith species and the cultivated force training of the Jedi academic tradition, a combination whose consequences for the depth and the nature of force perception in the resulting lineages were considerable. The beings who emerged from this intertwining carried within them, in ways that were biological as well as philosophical, the specific qualities that the Sith tradition would always afterwards regard as its most essential characteristics, the capacity for feeling the Force through the medium of intense emotion. Dawned. The ability to access through passion and hunger and grief and anger aspects of Force perception that the more composed traditions could not as easily reach, and the particular relationship to power and ambition and the drive toward mastery that the combination of Sith bloodline and Jedi training had produced in a form more concentrated and more consequential than either source tradition had contained alone. It was on Korriban, in the redstone valleys and beneath the amber sky of a world whose every surface seemed to vibrate with the dark current's presence, that the philosophical inheritance of Xendor's schism and the organic force tradition of the Sith people merged into something that deserved a new name because it was genuinely a new thing, not the continuation of either tradition that had contributed to it, but the creation of something that neither could have become without the other. The name it took was the name of the people whose world had received the exiles, and whose bloodline had given the synthesis its deepest roots. They became the Sith, not merely the people of Korriban, but the practitioners of the philosophy that Korriban had made possible, and the name carried forward into every subsequent century and every subsequent conflict the memory of that original meeting, the memory of a world of red stone and deep force resonance, where two traditions had found in each other the complement that each had separately lacked, and had combined into something whose full implications neither could have foreseen, and both, in their different ways, had made inevitable. The synthesis that Korriban had made possible did not remain confined to Korriban, which is the nature of things that have found the form that fully expresses their potential, the nature of ideas and philosophies and traditions that have achieved the particular combination of depth and vitality that makes containment within a single place not merely unlikely, but structurally impossible, as though the tradition itself participates in the Force's own tendency toward expansion and expression, and the filling of the space available to it with the fullness of what it actually is. The early Sith civilization that grew from the meeting of the exiled practitioners and the original inhabitants of the Redstone world was not, even in its earliest centuries of consolidation, a tradition content with the boundaries of the world that had given it its name and its character. It reached outward, first in the practical sense of exploration and the establishment of influence across the neighbouring systems of the region that would eventually be known as Sith space, and then in the deeper sense of philosophical elaboration of the systematic development of the ideas that the Korriban synthesis had generated into a comprehensive understanding of the Force and the galaxy and the proper relationship between beings of great power and the universe they inhabited. The political structure that accompanied this expansion was one of the features that distinguished the early Sith civilization most sharply from the traditions it had grown from, and it is worth pausing to examine it with some care, because it was not merely a practical arrangement for the governance of a growing civilization, but was itself a philosophical statement, a way of organizing social and political reality that expressed the deepest commitments of the Sith understanding of the Force and its relationship to power. The Jedi tradition and the Jedi Order that was developing from it in the galaxy's more settled regions had always maintained at least a formal commitment to the idea that Force sensitivity was a gift that carried obligations toward those who did not possess it, that the capability for perception and manipulation that the Force provided was in some fundamental sense held in trust for the larger community of living beings whose connection to the Force was less direct and less conscious than the trained practitioners. This was not always perfectly realized in practice, but as a philosophical commitment it shaped the institutional structures and the self-understanding of the Jedi tradition in ways that were genuine and consequential. The Sith civilization that developed on and around Korriban operated from a different philosophical premise, one whose logic was as internally coherent as the Jedi premise, and whose consequences were as far-reaching. The premise was that the Force, in its dark current expression, was not a trust to be held on behalf of others, but a natural hierarchy to be inhabited with full consciousness, that the gradations of Force sensitivity that existed among beings were not accidents of distribution to be managed with careful humility, but expressions of a genuine order of capability and therefore of appropriate authority, that those who could touch the Force most deeply and wield it most powerfully were not merely different from those who could not, but were, in a sense that the Sith tradition regarded as philosophically rigorous, rather than merely self-serving, more fully realized expressions of what the Force intended living beings to be. From this premise, the elaborate hierarchical structure of early Sith civilization followed with the particular kind of inevitability that philosophical premises always carry when they are taken seriously and pursued to their natural conclusions. The Dark Lords who emerged from this hierarchical structure were not, in the early centuries of Sith civilization's development, the figures of absolute and singular authority that the term would eventually come to designate in later periods of Sith history. They were rather the recognized apex of a complex hierarchy of Force users whose internal relationships were defined by the Sith understanding of power as the most legitimate basis for authority. The understanding that the capacity to demonstrate superior mastery of the Force's dark current was not merely evidence of greater capability, but was itself the most valid possible claim to the governance of those whose capability was less. The title of Dark Lord, rendered in the ancient Sith language as the term that would eventually be transliterated as Dark Lord of the Sith, was not inherited in the straightforward dynastic sense, was not passed from parent to child by the simple fact of biological succession, though lineage and bloodline were regarded with considerable significance in the Sith tradition, given the importance the synthesis with the Sith species had placed on the inheritance of Force sensitivity. It was claimed, demonstrated, and sustained through the ongoing expression of the power that justified it, which meant that the relationship between a Dark Lord and the hierarchy beneath them was never entirely stable, never entirely free of the particular tension that any system of power generates, when the basis of legitimate authority is capability rather than convention. Among the early Dark Lords, certain figures emerge from the fragmented accounts of this period with enough clarity and enough consistency across the different sources to allow something approaching a genuine portrait, though the portrait is always incomplete, always assembled from pieces whose original context has been partially lost to the vast span of time between their creation and any present moment of examination. The figure who appears most consistently in the accounts of the early Sith civilization's philosophical development, the one whose name recurs across the oldest and most serious of the surviving sources, with the particular weight that genuine historical significance tends to leave in the record even when the specific details of that significance have been partially obscured by time, is one who carried a name that the sources render in various transliterations, but whose essential form designates them as among the first to have systematized the Sith understanding of the Force into something that could be transmitted as doctrine rather than merely intuited through practice. This figure, whom later Sith scholars would regard as among the foundational architects of what the Sith tradition became in its most developed form, understood that the synthesis which Korriban had produced needed, if it was to persist and to grow and to resist the inevitable pressures that the galaxy's other Force traditions would eventually bring to bear against it, to be more than a collection of powerful practices united by a shared history of exile and a shared orientation toward the dark current. It needed to be a philosophy, complete and rigorous, and capable of addressing the deepest questions about the nature of the Force and the proper relationship of the Sith practitioner to it, with the same thoroughness and the same intellectual seriousness that the Jedi tradition was bringing to those questions from its own very different premises. The philosophical work of this period, which unfolded across generations rather than within the span of any single thinker's contribution, produced the earliest forms of what later Sith tradition would call the Sith Code, the compact formulation of the Sith understanding of the Force and the practitioner's relationship to it that would persist, in various forms and with various elaborations and contestations, across the entire subsequent history of the Sith tradition. The earliest versions of this code were not the pithy formulation familiar from later periods, not the concentrated verse whose very brevity was a philosophical statement about the relationship between the Sith understanding and the more elaborate doctrinal structures of the Jedi tradition. They were extended philosophical treatises, detailed arguments that work through the logic of the Sith position with the rigour appropriate to a tradition that understood itself as engaged in a genuine inquiry into the Force's nature, rather than simply justifying practices it had already decided to pursue. The core of the argument that these early texts developed was the claim that emotion, specifically the full and unreserved inhabitation of emotional experience, rather than its transcendence or its management, was not an obstacle to deep Force perception, but its most powerful catalyst, that the practitioner who allowed passion and desire and the specific form of hunger that the dark current amplified to move through them without resistance, was not losing their relationship to the Force in that movement, but finding it at its deepest and most truthful level. This was a serious philosophical position, and it is important to understand it as such rather than as the mere rationalization of self-indulgence, because the history of the Sith tradition makes considerably more sense when its foundational philosophy is engaged with seriously than when it is dismissed as sophistication draped over appetite. The Jedi and Jedi traditions had always operated from the premise that the cultivation of detachment and inner stillness was the appropriate preparation for deep Force perception, had always taught that the practitioner who was moved by desire and passion and the full current of emotional experience was less clearly in contact with the Force's deepest nature than the one who had learned to observe those movements from a position of cultivated equanimity. The Sith position was not simply the inversion of this, not merely the assertion that desire was good because detachment was bad, but a more careful argument that the equanimity the Jedi tradition cultivated was itself a form of distortion, a filtering of the Force's perception through a state of consciousness that excluded dimensions of the Force's nature as genuinely and as consequentially as it included others, and that the practitioner who believed they were perceiving the Force more clearly through stillness was in fact perceiving a version of the Force that their practice had shaped to be compatible with their practice, a recursion that produced internal consistency at the cost of genuine completeness. The civilization that this philosophy supported and that supported this philosophy was, in the centuries of its early development on and around Korriban, a civilization of considerable achievement across dimensions that the galaxy's later accounts of the Sith sometimes obscure in favour of the dramatic and the destructive. The Sith alchemical tradition, which would eventually produce some of the most significant and some of the most terrible applications of Force use to the physical transformation of matter and living things, had its earliest and in certain respects its most genuinely investigative expressions in this period, when the combination of the Jedi academic tradition's systematic rigour and the Sith species' instinctive Force attunement was producing practitioners whose understanding of the relationship between Force energy and physical matter was genuinely pioneering, whose experiments with the application of dark current Force use to the shaping and transformation of living things and material substances were conducted with the curiosity and the methodical attention of people who understood themselves as expanding the boundaries of knowledge rather than simply pursuing power. The architecture that the early Sith civilization produced on Korriban and the other worlds of their expanding sphere, the great temples and the elaborate tomb complexes and the valley structures that worked with the planet's natural Force resonance, rather than simply imposing form upon it from without, reflected a sophisticated understanding of how physical structures could be designed to amplify and channel Force energy, an understanding that drew on both the engineering traditions the exiled practitioners had brought from their time in the Jedi academies and the deep instinctive knowledge of Korriban's Force character that the original Sith people possessed. It was a civilization that knew itself to be different from the galaxy's mainstream Force traditions, and that had, by this point in its development, largely ceased to regard the difference as a wound. The grief and the anger of the original exile had not disappeared from the Sith tradition's emotional inheritance, had been instead transformed by the alchemy of the centuries into something that the tradition wore as identity rather than injury, as the defining characteristic of a people who understood that they had been excluded from one version of what the Force-using community of the galaxy might have been and had, through that exclusion, and in response to it, built something that the galaxy had not previously contained, and that the galaxy's mainstream traditions, whatever their considerable achievements, could not have built, could not have even conceived of building. From within the philosophical premises that governed and limited what they were willing to reach toward, the civilization that had built itself from exile and synthesis, and the particular philosophical confidence of a tradition that had stopped regarding its own difference as a wound could not, by the nature of what it was and what it believed about power and its proper expression, remain in the relative isolation of Korriban and its surrounding systems indefinitely. The Sith understanding of the Force carried within it a logic of expansion that was not separate from its deepest philosophical commitments, but was their natural and in some ways inevitable expression. The practical consequence of a worldview that regarded demonstrated capability as the most legitimate basis for authority, and that understood the dark current's amplification of ambition and hunger, not as a danger to be managed, but as the Force's own endorsement of the drive toward greater reach and greater mastery. A civilization built on these premises does not remain contained within the borders that circumstance assigned to its founding, not because its leaders are uniquely aggressive in some purely temperamental sense, but because the philosophy that organizes their understanding of what they are doing in the galaxy makes expansion the natural direction of everything they value. What the Sith had built on Korriban and the worlds of their early sphere was not, in their own understanding, a regional power among regional powers. It was the proper expression of what Force mastery entitled its possessors to. And the galaxy beyond Sith space was not a collection of independent civilizations with their own legitimate claims to sovereignty, but a space that had not yet been organized according to its proper principles. The first significant contact between the expanding Sith civilization and the galaxy's mainstream Force traditions did not occur as a single dramatic confrontation between fully formed opposing powers, which is the shape that retrospective accounts sometimes give it in the interest of narrative clarity. It occurred, as most significant historical contacts occur, gradually and at the edges, through the overlapping of spheres of influence and the friction generated by that overlapping, through encounters between individuals and small groups that accumulated over time into the awareness on both sides that what was occurring was not a series of isolated incidents, but the progressive revelation of a structural incompatibility between two civilizations whose understanding of the force and of power and of the proper organization of the galaxy made their coexistence in the same region of space increasingly difficult to sustain without the kind of direct confrontation that both sides, for different reasons and in different ways, had been approaching with the slow inevitability of tectonic processes. The Jedi Order, which had by this period consolidated from the Jedi tradition's post-Force Wars evolution into the more recognizable institutional form that would persist for thousands of years, understood what was moving toward them from the regions of Sith space, with a particular combination of philosophical and practical clarity that the best of their tradition's thinkers always brought to the assessment of threats, whose nature they had the honesty to examine without flinching from what the examination revealed. What it revealed was not simply a military threat, though the military dimension was real and considerable and would eventually demand a military response. What the most perceptive of the Jedi scholars and practitioners who turned their attention to the question of the expanding Sith civilization understood was that they were looking at something that had grown from the same roots as their own tradition, that bore in its deeper structure the marks of the Jedi inheritance that the Force Wars and the Schism had redirected rather than erased, and that this shared origin was not a reassuring fact, but, in certain respects, a complicating one, because it meant that the Sith tradition understood the Jedi tradition from the inside, understood its philosophical premises and its institutional vulnerabilities, and the specific places where the light side orientation that the Jedi had developed in the Force Wars aftermath created gaps in perception and practice that the Dark Current's different relationship to those questions did not create in the same way. They were not fighting, when the conflict eventually came, an enemy that was simply their opposite, simply the negation of everything they stood for. They were fighting a tradition that had developed from the same source, had asked many of the same questions, and had arrived at answers that were in some cases more internally consistent than the Jedi tradition was entirely comfortable acknowledging. The Great Hyperspace War, which is the designation that the records of this period apply to the first major military confrontation between the Sith Empire that had developed from the Korriban civilization and the Republic and Jedi Order that represented the galaxy's mainstream Force tradition, arrived with the particular quality of events that have been building so long beneath the surface of the visible, that when they finally break through, those who experience them have the strange sensation of being simultaneously surprised and entirely unsurprised, of having known that this was coming, and yet having been unable to fully prepare for the specific form of its arrival. The proximate cause, as proximate causes tend to be, was considerably less grand than the structural forces that had made some version of this confrontation inevitable, involving the arrival in Sith space of Republic hyperspace explorers whose navigation had brought them, without intention, into contact with a civilization that had not been part of the Republic's known galaxy, and that received the contact with the particular wariness of a power that understood itself to be engaged in a long historical competition with the traditions those explorers represented, whether the explorers themselves understood that or not. The Dark Lord who presided over the Sith Empire at this moment of first significant contact was a figure whose name the records preserve as Naga Sado, and the traditions that have survived from this period treat him with the complexity that genuinely significant historical figures always generate, as someone whose gifts were real and whose ambitions exceeded them in ways that produced consequences he could not fully control, even as he initiated them with the confidence of a being who believed his mastery of the Force and his understanding of the galaxy's political situation were equal to the opportunities that the explorer's arrival had presented. He was a Dark Lord in the fullest sense that the early Sith tradition understood the title, a practitioner of extraordinary capability whose relationship to the Force's dark current had produced, across the years of his development, a depth of perception and a range of Force technique that placed him among the most formidable Sith of his generation, and whose understanding of Sith alchemy and the specific applications of dark current Force use to the manipulation of matter and living things was regarded even within a tradition that had been developing those arts for centuries as exceptional. He was also a being whose ambition had, over the course of his ascent to the Dark Lord's position, gradually outpaced the wisdom that genuine mastery of the dark current required alongside the power it provided, and the accounts of his decision-making in the period surrounding the Great Hyperspace War reflect this imbalance with the particular clarity that retrospective assessment always provides. Though the clarity is real, even if its retrospective quality sometimes makes it seem more obvious than it could have appeared in the moment of the decisions themselves. He saw in the arrival of the Republic explorers not the dangerous complication that a more cautious assessment might have identified, not the premature exposure of Sith space to Republic attention, that the Sith Empire's long-term position might have been better served by managing carefully and quietly, but an opportunity, the opening of a pathway to the Republic's core worlds, whose existence he understood as an invitation from the Force itself for the Sith Empire to extend itself into the galaxy's wider spaces with the full expression of the power it had been building across the centuries of its development. The invitation was real in the sense that the opportunity was real, whether it was an invitation from the Force or simply from his own ambition's need to find external endorsement for what it had already decided was the question that his subsequent history answered in ways that the moment of the decision could not. The war that Naga Sadow initiated carried the Sith Empire's forces deeper into the Republic's territory than any previous Sith military action had reached, and the accounts of its early phases describe a campaign conducted with the full application of everything that the Sith tradition had developed across its centuries of philosophical and practical elaboration. Not merely the military force of trained Sith warriors and their armies, but the specific techniques of force use that the Sith alchemical tradition had refined into instruments of war, whose effects on the physical and psychological environment of the battlefield exceeded what ordinary military force could accomplish. Sith sorcery, which is the designation that the Republic and Jedi accounts of this period used to describe the application of dark current force techniques to effects that the light side-oriented Jedi practice did not replicate, and in some cases did not fully understand, was deployed in the Great Hyperspace War with a comprehensiveness that reflected both the genuine capability the Sith tradition had developed in this area and Naga Sadow's own particular strengths as a practitioner, his deep knowledge of the alchemical arts and his willingness to apply them in ways that the most serious of the Sith tradition's own ethical constraints, such as they were, might have counselled against. The Jedi response to the invasion was organised with the urgency that a threat of this magnitude demanded, and with the particular quality of commitment that the Jedi tradition brought to conflicts, it understood as existential, as contests not merely over territory or political influence, but over the fundamental character of the Force-using civilization the galaxy would sustain. They were not unprepared in the sense of being ignorant of what the Sith tradition was and what it was capable of. The centuries of overlapping contact at the edges of their respective spheres had provided enough information for the Jedi scholars and strategic thinkers to have formed genuine assessments of the threat. They were unprepared in the different and in some ways more difficult sense of facing an opponent whose specific techniques and specific applications of force capability did not map cleanly onto the Jedi tradition's own practice, whose approach to the Force created in the moment of direct confrontation effects that the light side orientation of Jedi practice was not ideally configured to counter, requiring in the practitioners who faced them a quality of adaptability and a willingness to reach into aspects of the Force that the Jedi tradition's post-Force Wars development had moved them away from. The war's resolution came not primarily through the decisive military victory of one side over the other, though military engagements occurred across multiple worlds of the Republic's inner systems, and the accounts of those engagements preserve the names of places and individuals with the gravity appropriate to events whose cost was measured in lives and in the destruction of civilizations that had been built across generations. It came through the particular combination of military pressure from the Republic and Jedi forces and the internal fracturing of the Sith Empire's own cohesion, the fracturing that the Sith tradition's foundational philosophy always made possible, and that the stresses of a war conducted at overextended supply lines and against a more numerous and more institutionally stable opponent than Naga Sadow's initial assessment had adequately accounted for now made actual. The power-based hierarchy of Sith civilization, which was philosophically coherent and in stable conditions, served to concentrate capability at the apex where it could be most effectively deployed, was in conditions of significant military stress a structure that generated betrayal as naturally as it generated loyalty, because the same logic that made the strongest Sith the proper ruler made any Sith who could demonstrate themselves stronger than the current ruler, the proper claimant to that ruler's position. And the conditions of a losing war provided both the motivation and the opportunity for that demonstration to be attempted. Naga Sadow's empire did not simply lose the Great Hyperspace War. It collapsed from within while losing it, which is a different kind of defeat, and one whose consequences for the Sith tradition were considerably more profound than a simple military loss would have been, because it demonstrated within the Sith's own experience of themselves a vulnerability that their philosophy created, and that their philosophy, given its foundational premises about power and its relationship to authority, could not simply argue away. The survivors scattered, as the practitioners who had lost the Force Wars had scattered before them, carrying into a new period of exile the accumulated inheritance of everything that the Sith civilization at its height had been and thought and built, and with them went the question that the collapse had forced into the open, the question of whether the Sith tradition's understanding of power was not only a philosophy about the Force, but also a structural problem for any civilization built upon it, a question whose various answers would generate the entire subsequent history of the Sith across the long and complicated millennia that followed the war's devastating conclusion. The question that the Great Hyperspace War's collapse had forced into the open did not receive a quick answer, which is the nature of questions that cut to the foundational premises of a tradition, rather than simply challenging its surface practices, questions whose honest engagement requires a community to examine not what it has done wrong in a particular instance, but what it has built into the structure of everything it does that makes certain kinds of wrong not merely possible but, under sufficient pressure, inevitable. The survivors of Naga Sadow's shattered empire carried that question with them into the dispersal that followed the war's catastrophic conclusion, carried it alongside the philosophical inheritance and the practical knowledge and the specific force techniques that the Sith civilization at its height had developed, and the carrying of it was not comfortable. It was not the kind of intellectual burden that a tradition at peace with itself can set down in the evening and take up again in the morning with the fresh energy of a new day. It was a wound that the dark current of the Force, which in the Sith understanding ran most powerfully through precisely the emotional states of grief and anger and the particular hunger of beings who have had something taken from them that they believed was rightfully theirs, amplified and sustained across the generations of the new dispersal with a consistency that ensured the question was never simply forgotten, never allowed to settle into the comfortable dormancy of an issue that the passage of time had made feel less urgent than it once had been. What emerged from this second great dispersal was not a single coherent response to the structural question the collapse had raised, which would have required a degree of collective philosophical deliberation that the conditions of dispersal and the fundamental character of the Sith tradition made equally impossible, but rather a set of individual responses developed by the most capable and the most intellectually serious of the surviving Sith practitioners across the long centuries that followed the war, responses that shared certain premises and diverged from each other in ways whose eventual consequences would shape the Sith tradition more profoundly than any external conflict had yet managed to do. The shared premise of these various responses was that the Great Hyperspace War's failure was not evidence against the foundational Sith understanding of the Force and its relationship to power, was not the demonstration that the Jedi tradition's light side orientation was more correct about the Force's deepest nature than the Sith philosophical inheritance had acknowledged. The divergence was in the diagnosis of what specifically had gone wrong, and in the proposed corrections to the tradition that the diagnosis implied. Among the survivors of the war's conclusion, one figure emerges from the accounts of this period with the particular clarity that genuine historical consequence tends to leave in the record, a clarity that is the more striking for the conditions under which it was achieved, conditions of exile and dispersal that would have reduced a less capable or less driven being to the simple survival mode that crisis tends to impose upon those it overtakes. The figure was a Sith Lord, whose name the records preserve as Darth Revan, though the traditions that have maintained this name across the vast span of time between the events themselves and any present recounting have layered upon it so many subsequent interpretations, and so many competing claims about what Revan represented, and what Revan chose, and what the consequences of those choices meant for the Sith tradition, that extracting a clear portrait from the accumulated weight of the tradition's self-accounting requires a sustained critical attention that the accounts themselves do not always make easy, What can be said with confidence, drawing on the most consistent elements of the various sources, is that Revan was among the most extraordinary Force users of their era, possessed of a quality of perception and a range of capability that placed them in the small company of practitioners whose gifts exceeded what the tradition that trained them had fully anticipated, and that this exceptional capability was accompanied by an intellectual restlessness and a willingness to question foundational premises that made Revan's engagement with the structural question of Sith civilization not merely more powerful than most of their contemporaries' engagement, but qualitatively different from it. Revan had been trained in the Jedi tradition, which is the fact about this figure that the accounts most consistently preserve, and that the Sith tradition's own subsequent engagement with Revan's legacy found most difficult to assimilate cleanly into its self-understanding, because it complicated the narrative of pure opposition between Jedi and Sith that both traditions sometimes preferred to the more unsettling truth that the boundary between them had always been more permeable than the institutional forms they had developed to maintain it suggested. Revan had not simply defected from the Jedi Order in the manner of a practitioner who had found the light side orientation philosophically unsatisfying and sought the dark current's different quality of perception. Revan had moved between the traditions with a fluency and a genuine engagement, with both that the accounts describe as something the Jedi Council found profoundly disturbing. Not because the movement itself was unprecedented, the history of practitioners who had crossed the boundary between the traditions was long enough to constitute a genuine pattern, but because the quality of Revan's engagement with both sides of the Force's nature suggested a depth of understanding that the institutional forms of both traditions had been developed, in part, specifically to prevent the understanding that the Force did not actually divide itself along the lines that either tradition's philosophy insisted upon, that the categories of light and dark were frameworks imposed by beings with particular interests in maintaining those frameworks, rather than features of the Force's own deepest nature. This understanding, which the most serious thinkers of both traditions would have recognized as philosophically serious even as they found its practical implications deeply threatening to everything their traditions had built, expressed itself in Revan's approach to the Sith tradition's structural question with a directness that the tradition had not previously encountered. The problem with Sith civilization as it had developed on Korriban and expressed itself in the Great Hyperspace War was not, in Revan's assessment, that the Sith had pursued power, which was the Jedi tradition's diagnosis, and which the Sith tradition's various internal critics had never been able to fully adopt without abandoning the philosophical premises that made them Sith rather than reluctant Jedi. The problem was that the Sith tradition had pursued power without the strategic discipline, and the long-term thinking that power, to be genuinely useful rather than simply spectacular, required. The ambition that the dark current amplified was real and was genuinely connected to the Force's capacity for perception and mastery. The wisdom to deploy that ambition in service of objectives whose achievement did not simultaneously undermine the conditions necessary for sustaining what had been achieved was what the Sith tradition had consistently failed to cultivate in its practitioners at the level of the tradition's deepest formation, rather than as an individual virtue that some practitioners happened to develop while most did not. Revan's proposed correction to this structural failure was the contribution to Sith philosophical development that the tradition's most serious subsequent thinkers would engage with most seriously, not always agreeing with it and often contesting its specific formulations, but recognizing in it an engagement with the actual problem that the Great Hyperspace War's collapse had identified, rather than an elaborate avoidance of it. The correction was the discipline of patience applied not as a restraint upon ambition, but as its most effective expression. The understanding that the practitioner who could hold the full force of their passion, and their hunger, and their drive toward mastery in sustained productive tension with a strategic intelligence, capable of thinking across years and decades and centuries, rather than simply toward the next expression of strength, was not a lesser Sith for the holding, but a more complete one. Was not compromising the dark current's amplification of their capability, but channeling it through the instrument of a long-term perspective that multiplied its effective power in ways that the direct and immediate expression of strength alone could not achieve. This was not the Jedi Council of Detachment, it was the Sith Council of Patience as itself a form of power, the patience of a being who understands that the full expression of their strength requires the careful preparation of conditions that make that expression decisive rather than merely impressive, The Jedi Civil War that Revan's subsequent history produced was the first major test of this corrected approach, and its account in the records of this period is one of the most extensively preserved and most extensively contested of the entire era, because the war involved not merely the familiar opposition of Sith and Jedi, but the particular complication of a conflict in which one of its central figures had been trained by the tradition they were fighting against, carried within them a genuine understanding of that tradition's strengths and vulnerabilities that ordinary opposition did not provide, and deployed that understanding with a strategic intelligence and a comprehensive preparation that the Jedi Order had not previously encountered in a Sith opponent in quite this form. The campaigns that Revan directed in that conflict showed the influence of the corrected philosophy in their planning and their execution, showed the combination of dark current force capability and long-term strategic thinking that the correction had proposed as the Sith tradition's path out of the recurring pattern of spectacular rise and catastrophic collapse that its history had established. There were victories of genuine strategic significance, not merely the expression of force power in individual engagements, but the patient construction of military and political situations whose resolution served objectives that had been identified long before the engagements that resolved them. And yet Revan's own history did not conclude with the vindication of the correction, which is the fact that the tradition's subsequent engagement with this figure found most difficult and most productive to think about, because it suggested that the structural problem of Sith civilization was more deeply rooted than even the most serious and most gifted attempt to address it had managed to reach. Revan was captured by the Jedi, and the capture was followed by the particular intervention that the Jedi tradition had developed for circumstances in which a practitioner of great capability had moved so far into the dark current that the tradition's ordinary means of persuasion and reorientation were insufficient. The intervention of memory alteration and the reconstruction of identity that the accounts of this period treat with the ethical ambivalence appropriate to an action whose justification and whose cost cannot be cleanly separated from each other. The Revan who emerged from this intervention was not the Revan who had entered it, was a being whose sense of self had been rebuilt around a different understanding of what they were and what they had done, and the subsequent history of this rebuilt self, with its own complications and its own returns and its own eventual reconciliations with the knowledge of what the original self had been, belongs to a longer account than the present one requires in its full detail. What the present account requires is the recognition of what Revan's trajectory, from Jedi training through Sith philosophy to the corrected approach and its ultimate failure to resolve the structural question, contributed to the tradition's ongoing development. The contribution was not the correction itself, which had been genuinely important and genuinely influential, but the demonstration that the correction was insufficient, that the dark current's tendency to consume the strategic discipline that was meant to channel it rather than replace it was not a problem that could be solved by individual genius, however extraordinary, that the solution required if it was to be stable across generations and not merely within the span of a single exceptional practitioner's life, would need to be embedded in the tradition's institutional structure, rather than held in place by the personal discipline of whoever happened to be its most capable current representative. This was the lesson that the Sith tradition's most serious subsequent thinkers drew from the era that Revan's history had opened, and it was the lesson that would, after many more centuries of conflict and collapse, and the particular kind of learning that only repeated catastrophic failure reliably produces, eventually lead to the most consequential restructuring the Sith tradition had yet undergone, the restructuring that a single figure would impose upon it, with the particular ruthlessness of someone who had studied every previous failure with complete honesty, and had drawn from that study conclusions that the tradition had never previously been willing to accept about what its own survival actually required. The lesson that Revan's trajectory had made available to the Sith tradition was not immediately absorbed, which is the nature of lessons whose full implication requires of the tradition receiving them a degree of institutional self-examination that traditions built around the premise of power and mastery find particularly difficult to sustain. Because the honest examination of structural failure requires a quality of humility that the dark current's amplification of ambition and pride does not naturally encourage, and that the Sith philosophical inheritance had never identified as a virtue worth cultivating in its own right. The centuries that followed the Jedi Civil War's conclusion and the dispersal of the Sith forces that Revan's capture had accelerated were centuries of the, by now, familiar pattern, the pattern that the tradition's own history had established across so many previous cycles of rise and collapse, that a sufficiently long-lived observer might have been forgiven for wondering whether the pattern was not a failure of the tradition but its essential character. The recurring expression of a philosophical inheritance that generated extraordinary individual capability and equally extraordinary individual conflict, that produced Dark Lords of genuine and sometimes unprecedented power and then produced, with the same inevitability that the tides follow the moon, the conditions under which those Dark Lords destroyed each other and the civilization they had built, in the process of demonstrating which among them was most worthy of the authority they all believed their power entitled them to claim. The Sith Brotherhood of Darkness, which was the organizational form that the tradition took in the centuries immediately preceding the restructuring that would eventually change everything, was in certain respects the most honest expression of the tradition's unreformed character that the long history of Sith civilization had yet produced. Honest in the specific sense that it had abandoned the pretense of a unified hierarchy under a single supreme authority and had instead organized itself around the recognition that what the Sith tradition actually generated, given its foundational premises, was a collection of extraordinarily powerful individual practitioners whose relationships to each other were defined by competition as much as by cooperation, whose alliance against the Jedi and the Republic was genuine, but whose internal dynamics were the constant low-level expression of the power struggle that the tradition's philosophy made permanent, and that no institutional arrangement had yet found a way to resolve without simply suppressing it in ways that eventually failed. The Brotherhood was a coalition of lords, each maintaining their own power base and their own followers, nominally coordinated towards shared objectives and practically competing for the dominance that the Sith understanding of power as the basis of legitimate authority made every capable practitioner believe was rightfully theirs, if they could demonstrate the capability to claim it. This arrangement had certain practical advantages that the tradition's most tactically minded members appreciated, distributing the risk of the tradition's exposure to the Jedi and Republic opposition across multiple centers of power, rather than concentrating it in a single Dark Lord whose defeat or death had historically brought the entire structure of Sith civilization down with it, making the tradition more resilient to the kind of decisive military blow that the Great Hyperspace War's conclusion had demonstrated a unified Sith Empire was vulnerable to receiving. What it sacrificed in exchange for this resilience was the coherence and the strategic coordination that genuine long-term power required. The ability to pursue objectives across timescales that exceeded what any individual lord's interest in their own position and their own survival could sustain, without the overriding authority of a structure capable of compelling compliance with a plan whose full execution extended beyond what immediate self-interest would have motivated. The Brotherhood fought the Jedi and the Republic with genuine ferocity and genuine force capability and genuine moments of strategic brilliance from individual lords whose gifts were as extraordinary as any the tradition had produced. It could not, and the accounts that preserve his history are among the most carefully maintained in the Sith tradition's surviving records, because the tradition that existed after him was so entirely his creation, so thoroughly the expression of his singular analysis of everything that had gone wrong and his singular prescription for what a corrected Sith tradition required, that the records of his life and his reasoning were understood by those who came after him as foundational documents rather than merely historical ones, as the explanatory texts that made sense of everything they were doing and everything they were required to be. Bane had come to the Sith Brotherhood not from the privileged circumstances that the tradition's hierarchical structure tended to favour, not from a lineage of established Sith Lords whose connections and whose accumulated knowledge of the tradition's internal politics would have smoothed the path of a gifted student toward recognition and advancement. He had come from the mining world of Apatros, from circumstances of poverty and physical labour, and the particular kind of psychological formation that a difficult early life in a closed and exploitative environment produces in beings whose capabilities greatly exceed what their circumstances were designed to accommodate. A formation that includes genuine resilience and genuine self-reliance and genuine contempt for the kinds of social conventions and institutional arrangements that exist primarily to maintain the comfort of those they benefit, rather than to serve any purpose that a clear-eyed examination of their actual function could justify. He had discovered his force sensitivity in the particular way that beings of extraordinary capability sometimes discover it under extreme stress, as an eruption of power whose violence and whose effectiveness in addressing the immediate crisis that triggered it carried within it none of the careful cultivation that the traditions tried to provide their practitioners before exposing them to the reality of what the Force could do, and he had sought out the Brotherhood with the particular determination of someone who understood, without being able to fully articulate the understanding, that what had happened to him was significant, and that the significance required a context he had not yet found. The Brotherhood's academies on Korriban, where the red stone of the world that had given the tradition its name still resonated with the accumulated Force presence of the generations of Sith who had trained and lived and died within its valleys, received Bane as a student of notable raw capability and somewhat less notable social integration, a being whose gifts the instructors recognized, and whose temperament they found more difficult to accommodate than the gifts that accompanied it. He was not, in the conventional sense of the Brotherhood's internal culture, a good student of the Brotherhood's specific form of Sith practice, not because his Force capability was insufficient, which it manifestly was not, but because he could not sustain without visible resistance the deference that the Brotherhood's hierarchical arrangements expected from its students toward their instructors and toward the lords who presided over the tradition's various power centers. His resistance was not simple arrogance, though arrogance was present in it, and the accounts of his academy years do not conceal it. It was the more specific form of resistance that genuine intelligence produces in beings who are being asked to defer to arrangements whose justification, when examined with sufficient honesty, does not survive the examination, who are being asked to accept as authoritative the judgments of beings whose authority rests on the tradition's formal recognition of their status, rather than on the demonstrated capability that the tradition's own foundational philosophy insisted was the only legitimate basis for authority. He found in the ancient records that the Brotherhood maintained in its Korriban archives, records that preserved the philosophical history of the Sith tradition across the centuries from Korriban's earliest development through the various rises and collapses and dispersals and reconstitutions that the tradition had undergone, the material for the analysis that would eventually produce his restructuring of everything. He was, by all accounts, a reader of extraordinary seriousness and extraordinary retention, someone who engaged with the texts of the tradition's philosophical history not as a student mastering a curriculum but as a diagnostician, examining a patient whose recurring illness had a cause that the patient's own physicians had consistently failed to identify correctly, because their identification of it would have required them to acknowledge their own complicity in the condition. He read the accounts of the Great Hyperspace War and the Jedi Civil War, and the various other cycles of Sith rise and collapse, with the specific question that Revan's history had made available, but that the tradition had never fully answered, not what had gone wrong in each instance, which the accounts themselves generally acknowledged with reasonable accuracy, but what structural feature of the tradition made going wrong in essentially the same way the default outcome, regardless of the specific individuals involved and the specific circumstances of each cycle. The answer he arrived at was simple in its formulation and devastating in its implications, simple in the way that accurate diagnoses of deep structural problems tend to be simple once they have been made, their simplicity the product not of shallowness, but of the penetration that cuts through the complexity of surface phenomena to the generative principle beneath them. The Brotherhood was weak, he concluded, not despite its multiplication of powerful Sith Lords, but because of it. The tradition's failure to achieve lasting dominance over the Jedi and the Republic was not the result of insufficient individual power among its practitioners, which would have been a comfortable diagnosis because it would have implied a solution involving simply producing more capable practitioners, something the tradition already understood how to attempt. The failure was the result of the tradition's own philosophy, applied without the corrective that the philosophy's internal logic required, but that the tradition had never been willing to impose. If power was the basis of legitimate authority, and if the dark current of the Force amplified the individual practitioner's drive toward mastery and dominance, then a tradition of multiple powerful Sith Lords would always and inevitably spend more of its collective energy on the internal competition for supremacy among those lords than on the external projection of force against the tradition's actual enemies, because the internal competition was what the tradition's foundational premises made most natural and most urgent to the beings shaped by those premises. The solution was as direct as the diagnosis, and as devastating in its implications for the Brotherhood that had trained him and the lords whose authority he was effectively declaring illegitimate. the Sith tradition needed to be reduced to two: one master, who would embody and direct the tradition's full accumulated power without the dilution and the internal conflict that multiple lords inevitably produced; one apprentice. This was the rule of two, and Bane understood it not as a practical compromise with the tradition's recurring problem, but as the philosophical completion of what the Sith tradition had always actually required. The logical conclusion of the premise that power was the only legitimate basis for authority applied at last with the consistency and the ruthlessness that the premise itself demanded. The destruction of the Brotherhood that followed Bane's arrival at this conclusion was accomplished not through the kind of direct military confrontation that a being of his capability might have pursued against the lords whose authority he was displacing, which would have been the Brotherhood's own preferred method and which would have confirmed rather than transcended the tradition's structural problem. It was accomplished through the particular combination of strategic patience and absolute ruthlessness that the rule of two itself embodied as a philosophy, through the careful identification and cultivation of the conditions that would bring the Brotherhood into a final confrontation with the Jedi and Republic forces that would destroy it comprehensively, leaving in the wreckage of that destruction the space for the new and corrected tradition to begin its patient 1,000-year preparation for the moment that Bane, thinking across a timescale that no previous Sith Lord had maintained as the operative frame for their strategic planning, understood as the actual objective, not the defeat of the Jedi in the next war, but the defeat of the Jedi in the war that the tradition's full maturation, across as many generations as the maturation required, would eventually make possible. The rule of two did not announce itself to the galaxy, which was precisely the point of it. Precisely the quality that distinguished it most sharply from every previous form the Sith tradition had taken, and that made it, for the first time in the tradition's long and catastrophically visible history, a genuine strategic instrument rather than simply a philosophical position. Every previous iteration of Sith civilization had understood its own existence as something to be demonstrated, had regarded the expression of its power as inseparable from the power itself, had built towers and forged empires and launched wars whose scale made the tradition's presence in the galaxy undeniable, and whose undeniability was, in the understanding of the lords who directed them, a feature rather than a vulnerability, the proper expression of a philosophy that regarded the visible exercise of dominance as the most authentic form of what the Sith tradition was. Bane understood this instinct and understood it as the deepest source of everything that had gone wrong. The recurring self-advertisement of a tradition whose philosophical premises made concealment feel like weakness, and whose feeling that concealment was weakness, had ensured that the galaxy's opposing forces always had sufficient warning of the Sith's intentions to organize the response that defeated them. The rule of two was, among its other qualities, a rule of silence, of the patient inhabitation of invisibility, not as a temporary tactical measure, but as the fundamental strategic condition under which the tradition's 1,000-year preparation would be conducted. Bane's own apprentice was a young woman whose name in the records appears as Darth Xana, and the relationship between them was the first full expression of what the rule of two meant in practice, which is to say it was more complex and more psychologically dense than the clean formulation of the rule itself suggested, more layered with the specific tensions that arise when the most fundamental dynamic of a relationship is that one party is constantly preparing to destroy the other, and the other party is fully aware of this, and is simultaneously learning from the first party the very skills that the destruction, when it comes, will require. The accounts that preserve the early history of the rule of two's practice describe the relationship between master and apprentice, with a care that reflects the understanding that what Bane had created was not simply a more efficient organizational structure for Sith power, but a new form of human, or rather a new form of Force-user relationship. One that had no precedent in either the Jedi or the previous Sith traditions, and whose psychological and philosophical dimensions were as significant as its practical ones. Xana had been found by Bane in the aftermath of the Brotherhood's destruction, found in the particular way that the rule of two required its masters to find their apprentices, not through the institutional processes of an academy that trained many students toward general competence, but through the direct identification of a specific individual whose particular combination of force sensitivity and personal character, and the specific quality of darkness that their nature and their experience had already begun to cultivate, made them the right material for what the rule of two's apprentice position actually required. The position required not merely capability, though capability was the baseline below which no candidate was worth considering. It required because the academy system had been designed to produce many practitioners of reasonable competence rather than one practitioner of complete mastery, and the economies of scale that the production of many required had imposed upon the training a generality and a shallowness that the production of one, with the full attention and the full accumulated knowledge of a master of Bane's depth, did not need to accept. He taught her everything. Not everything sequentially, not everything according to a curriculum designed to build from foundational principles toward advanced applications, but everything in the integrated way that genuine mastery is always transmitted when the transmitter understands that the parts of a tradition derive their meaning from the whole, and that teaching the parts, without simultaneously teaching their relationship to the whole, produces practitioners who can execute techniques without understanding why the techniques work, and therefore cannot adapt them when the conditions under which they were learned do not obtain. He taught her the philosophical history of the tradition, the full account of every rise and every collapse, and the structural reasons for the collapses that his own analysis had identified, so that she understood not merely what the rule of two required, but why it required it, understood it well enough to maintain it under the pressures that would inevitably test it across the generations of its application. The concealment that the rule of two's strategic condition required was not passive concealment. Not the simple absence of the Sith tradition from the galaxy's visible affairs, which would have been noticed and investigated by a Jedi Order whose attention to the dark side's movements in the Force was sophisticated enough to distinguish between the genuine absence of Sith activity and its apparent absence. It was active concealment, the deliberate construction of a presence in the galaxy's affairs that was sufficient to explain what the Force-sensitive could perceive, without revealing what actually underlay it, a performance of ordinariness and political inconsequence that required of its practitioners exactly the kind of strategic intelligence and long-term thinking that the rule of two had been designed to cultivate. Bane and Xana moved through the galaxy as beings whose Force capability was real, but whose Sith identity was invisible, whose interactions with the Republic's political structures and the Jedi Order's monitoring of dark side activity were managed with the precision of practitioners who understood that every interaction was a test of the concealment, and that a single failure of the concealment could bring down upon the two of them the full organized response of the galaxy's dominant Force tradition, a response that two beings, however extraordinarily capable, could not survive in the way that an empire of thousands might have survived it. The Jedi Order in this period believed, and the belief was carefully maintained by the absence of evidence to contradict it, that the Sith had been destroyed in the final conflict that had ended the Brotherhood, that the tradition which had opposed them across so many centuries and so many cycles of war had finally been comprehensively defeated, rather than simply driven into a new form of existence that was more dangerous precisely because it was less visible. This belief was not the result of insufficient intelligence or insufficient attention on the Jedi's part. It was the result of Bane's correct understanding that the Jedi tradition, shaped by its light side orientation and its centuries of experience with Sith civilizations that had always eventually revealed themselves through the imperative to demonstrate their power, was not structurally prepared to maintain indefinite vigilance against a threat that showed no signs of existing. The Jedi were practitioners of the present moment, trained to perceive what the Force showed them rather than what the Force's silence might be concealing, and the Force's silence on the subject of Sith activity, carefully maintained by two practitioners who understood the importance of silence as a strategic instrument, was legible to the Jedi Order as absence rather than as the particular kind of presence that knows how to appear absent. The succession of master and apprentice that Bane's rule established as the mechanism of the tradition's continuation was, in its first several generations, the most significant test of whether the rule's philosophical logic could survive the psychological and practical pressures of actual implementation, pressures that the clean formulation of the rule itself did not fully capture. Each master had to train their apprentice completely enough that the apprentice could eventually defeat them, which required a quality of genuine investment in the apprentice's development that the dark current's amplification of self-preservation instincts made psychologically complicated, required of the master the holding in productive tension of the genuine desire to survive and the genuine understanding that the tradition's continuation required their eventual replacement. Each apprentice had to learn without revealing the full extent of what they had learned, had to grow toward the capability that would eventually justify the attempt against the master without triggering the master's recognition that the apprentice had reached the threshold that made the attempt appropriate, because a master who recognized too early that the apprentice was ready would not wait for the apprentice to initiate, but would respond with the preemptive action that the tradition's logic also endorsed. This dynamic, which Bane had formulated as the rule's essential self-renewing mechanism, the means by which the tradition ensured that its apex was always occupied by genuine mastery rather than merely established authority, was in practice a relationship of extraordinary psychological intensity, a sustained engagement between two beings, each of whom was fully aware of the other's ultimate intention, and neither of whom could allow that awareness to interfere with the transmission and the reception of knowledge that the rule required. The accounts of the early master-apprentice pairs in the Rule of Two's implementation describe this dynamic with a frankness that suggests the practitioners themselves understood it as one of the tradition's most demanding and most philosophically revealing features, the feature that most clearly distinguished the Sith understanding of the relationship between teacher and student from the Jedi understanding, which was organized around the cultivation of trust and the protection of the vulnerable student's development from the pressures that might distort it. The Sith understanding was that the relationship between master and apprentice was the most honest possible expression of the tradition's deepest premises about power and its relationship to authority, a relationship in which the abstract philosophical claim that capability was the only legitimate basis for authority was lived rather than merely asserted, tested in the most direct and most consequential way available. By making the succession itself dependent on the demonstration of superior capability in the most unambiguous arena the tradition possessed. Across the generations that followed Bane and Xana, the Rule of Two produced a lineage of practitioners whose individual histories were as varied as the galaxy's changing political landscape required them to be, some operating close to the Republic's political centers, where the preparation for the tradition's eventual emergence required the cultivation of influence among the powerful, some maintaining the tradition's philosophical and force technique inheritance in the more isolated conditions that the concealment's demands sometimes imposed, all of them shaped by the specific formation that the Rule of Two's master-apprentice dynamic created in beings who were trained from the beginning to understand that their relationship to power was not mediated by the institutional structures and the collective agreements that the Republic's civilization had built to manage the exercise of capability among ordinary beings. That the only relevant measure of their standing was the force capability they had developed and the intelligence and patience with which they deployed it, in service of objectives that extended, as Bane had always insisted they must extend, across timescales that individual lifetimes could not encompass, but that the Rule of Two's mechanism of succession was specifically designed to bridge. The galaxy changed around them across those centuries, changed in the ways that galaxies change when the civilizations that inhabit them are not being actively disrupted by the kind of catastrophic conflict that the Sith tradition's previous iterations had regularly provided change through the ordinary accumulation of political shifts and economic developments, and the slow geological pressure of demographic movements and technological advances. And the two Sith who were always present in that changing galaxy watched the changes with the attention of beings whose interest in the Republic's political structure was not the citizen's interest, or the scholar's interest, but the strategist's interest, the interest of practitioners who were assessing, across the long patient decades of the concealment, where the Republic's political arrangements were most vulnerable to the specific kind of corruption and manipulation that would, at the right moment, make possible the emergence from concealment that the tradition's entire 1,000-year preparation had been building toward. They were not waiting for the galaxy to become ready in some passive sense. They were preparing it, with the patience and the precision and the dark current clarity that the Rule of Two had cultivated in them across the generations, for the moment that Bane had identified as the tradition's true objective, the moment that would not arrive until the preparation was complete, and that would be unmistakable when it did. The preparation that Bane had envisioned as the tradition's 1,000-year project did not proceed as a single unbroken line of development, moving with steady confidence toward its predetermined conclusion, which would have been a simpler and in many ways a more comfortable account than what the records of those centuries actually preserve. It proceeded the way that long preparations always proceed, when they are conducted by beings whose individual lives are finite, and whose transmission of purpose across the generations depends on the quality of each successive master-apprentice relationship, rather than on an institutional memory that exists independently of the individuals who carry it, which is to say it proceeded with variations in pace and in direction, and in the specific quality of the strategic thinking that different pairs brought to the shared objective. With periods of remarkable progress toward the conditions Bane had identified as necessary, and with periods of stagnation or apparent regression that the subsequent generation of practitioners had to recognize honestly and address with the same diagnostic clarity that Bane himself had brought to the tradition's entire accumulated history of failure. The rule of two was not a guarantee of the outcome Bane had designed it to produce. It was a structure whose consistent application across the generations created the conditions under which that outcome became possible, and the difference between a guarantee and a possibility of the right kind, properly prepared for and properly pursued, was exactly the kind of distinction that the Sith tradition, at its most philosophically serious, understood as the difference between the naive ambition that the Brotherhood had embodied and the disciplined patience that the rule of two required. Among the variations that the centuries produced in the lineage of masters and apprentices that Bane's restructuring had initiated, certain figures emerge from the accounts as having contributed most significantly to the specific direction the preparation eventually took. Figures whose particular gifts or particular circumstances or particular quality of engagement with the tradition's long-term objective left in the lineage's development marks that persisted beyond their individual lifetimes in the form of philosophical refinements or strategic orientations or specific force techniques whose development represented genuine advances rather than merely the maintenance of what had been inherited. The tradition that Bane had created was not static, could not be static if the rule of two's mechanism was working as intended, because each new master who had defeated their predecessor and taken the tradition's direction into their hands brought to that direction the specific quality of their own capability and their own intelligence and their own assessment of what the changing galaxy required of the preparation, and the combination of consistency in the tradition's foundational structure with variation in the individual judgment of those who directed it across the generations was itself one of the rule of two's most significant practical achievements, the achievement of a tradition that could remain coherent across centuries without becoming rigid, that could maintain the long-term objective without losing the adaptability that changing circumstances required. The republic that the rule of two's lineage observed across those centuries was itself changing in ways whose significance the most perceptive of the Sith practitioners who watched it recognized as important not merely as background information about the political environment they were operating within, but as evidence about the specific vulnerabilities and the specific points of leverage that the preparation needed to cultivate in order to make the eventual emergence from concealment decisive rather than merely dramatic. The Republic was old, in the particular way that very old institutions are old, carrying within its accumulated structures and its accumulated traditions and its accumulated political arrangements the weight of all the compromises and all the accumulated precedents and all the gradual drift from original purposes that age inevitably produces in institutions whose size and whose complexity have outgrown the capacity of any individual or any small group to perceive completely and to direct coherently. It was not corrupt in a simple or uniform sense, not an institution that had abandoned its foundational commitments to justice and representation and the rule of law in favour of naked self-interest in the way that more dramatic political failures tend to announce themselves. It was corrupt in the more difficult and more consequential way that very old institutions tend to become corrupt, through the accumulation of so many layers of procedure and precedent, and the political arrangements that powerful interests had embedded within those procedures that the institution's actual behaviour had gradually and almost imperceptibly diverged from the purposes its foundational commitments described, without any single moment of betrayal that could be identified and addressed, without any clear threshold having been crossed that the institution's own mechanisms of self-correction could be mobilized to respond to. The Senate that nominally governed the Republic in the period approaching the preparation's culmination was a body that the Sith practitioners observing it from within their concealment understood with a clarity that the body's own members frequently lacked, understood as an institution whose formal mechanisms of deliberation and consensus had become, across the centuries, less the means by which the Republic's diverse member worlds arrived at collective decisions that genuinely reflected their interests, and more the arena in which powerful interests competed for the specific procedural advantages that translated in the long run into the outcomes those interests had already determined they required. An arena where the deliberation was real in the sense that its participants genuinely believed in what they were doing, but where the outcomes were shaped by structural conditions that the deliberation itself could not adequately examine, because the examination would have required questioning the structural conditions that made the deliberation possible. This was, for the Sith practitioners who had been studying it across the generations with the strategic interest of beings who intended to use it, an extraordinarily rich environment for the specific kind of long-term manipulation that the Rule of Two's patient approach made possible, an environment in which the introduction of carefully designed pressures at carefully identified points of existing stress could produce, over time, outcomes whose connection to the pressures that had initiated them would be invisible to any observer who was not in possession of the complete map of what had been done and why. The figure who brought the preparation to its culmination was not the first of the Rule of Two's masters to operate within the Republic's political structures, but he was the first to do so with a comprehensive strategic vision that encompassed not merely the immediate tactical objectives of a particular period's Sith activity, but the full arc of what the tradition's emergence from concealment would require, and the specific sequence of conditions that had to be established before that emergence could be attempted with confidence that it would be final rather than simply another iteration of the recurring cycle that Bane had devoted his life to ending. His name in the Sith tradition was Darth Sidious, and the name he carried in the Republic's political world was Sheev Palpatine, a name associated with the planet Naboo and with a political career of remarkable apparent modesty in its early stages, a career that had moved through the conventional channels of provincial and then galactic politics with the patient incrementalism of someone whose ambitions, whatever they actually were, expressed themselves in the form of conventional political advancement rather than the kind of dramatic acceleration that would have attracted the attention of people whose attention he could not afford to attract. Sidious had been trained by a master whose own contribution to the preparation had been as significant in its specific domain as any of the contributions that the preceding generations had made. A master known as Darth Plagueis, whose particular area of Force investigation had pushed the boundaries of what the Sith tradition had previously attempted in its engagement with the Dark Current's relationship to life and death, and the specific mechanisms of biological existence. Plagueis had pursued across the years of his own mastery the question that the Sith tradition's philosophical inheritance had always approached but never resolved, the question of whether the dark current of the Force could be used not merely to extend the practitioner's own life through the techniques that the tradition had developed across the centuries, but to actually overcome death in the more fundamental sense, to develop an understanding of the Force's relationship to living beings so complete that the transition that death represented could be interrupted or reversed by a practitioner of sufficient skill and sufficient mastery of the specific mechanisms involved. This was not an investigation that the Jedi tradition had pursued, or had pursued openly, and the accounts that preserve the outline of Plagueis' work in this area treat it with the gravity appropriate to a project whose implications, had it succeeded completely, would have been among the most consequential in the entire history of Force use. The training that Plagueis provided to Sidious was training in the full inheritance of the Rule of Two's accumulated knowledge and power, but it was also training shaped by Plagueis' specific philosophical orientation, his understanding of the Force as something that could be not merely used, but interrogated at its most fundamental level, its deepest mechanisms examined and potentially redirected, in ways that the tradition's previous engagement with the Dark Current had not attempted because the previous engagement had been oriented primarily toward the practical applications of Force power, rather than toward the theoretical understanding of what Force power actually was, and where its apparent limits came from, and whether those limits were genuine features of the Force's nature, or simply the current horizon of the tradition's accumulated knowledge. Sidious received this orientation and the specific capabilities that Plagueis' investigation had produced, and added to it the quality that his own nature most essentially contributed, which was a political intelligence of such comprehensive scope and such penetrating accuracy that the Republic's complex institutional landscape was legible to him in the way that a mechanism is legible to an engineer who has spent decades studying its operation, who knows not merely what it does, but exactly how it does it, and exactly where the application of precisely calibrated force will produce the specific outputs that the engineer requires. The eventual destruction of Plagueis by Sidious, which followed the tradition's rule with the completeness that the rule required, while also expressing the specific logic of Sidious's own assessment that the time for the preparation's culmination had arrived, and that the continued existence of his master in a position of formal authority over him was no longer a condition that served the tradition's advancement, was accomplished with a thoroughness and a calm that the accounts of this event preserve as characteristic of the being who had spent his entire existence in the patient construction of a plan whose execution required exactly this quality of dispassion at exactly this moment. Plagueis died without the full awareness of what was being done to him until it was being done, which was itself a demonstration of the rule of two's mechanism working as Bane had intended. The apprentice having grown to genuine mastery without the master's full recognition of the growth, the succession occurring not as a dramatic confrontation of declared rivals, but as the quiet and permanent resolution of a relationship that had reached its natural conclusion. What Sidious inherited from his master was the tradition's full accumulated power and the specific philosophical and technical advances that Plagueis' investigation had produced. And what he added from his own preparation was the political position and the political understanding that the tradition had never previously possessed in this form. The combination of a Sith master of the rule of two's fully matured lineage and a figure who occupied a significant place in the Republic's own governance structure, who was known to the Senate and to the Jedi Order as a political being whose force sensitivity, if they were aware of it at all, was understood as irrelevant to his political function rather than as the most essential fact about him. The concealment had been maintained across 1,000 years, and across the lineage of every master and apprentice who had carried it, and Sidious was its final expression. The practitioner in whom the tradition's long patience and the tradition's long preparation had produced the specific combination of force mastery and political capability and strategic comprehensiveness that Bane had identified as what the tradition's emergence from concealment would require. The galaxy did not know he was there, which was precisely as he had arranged it, and the arrangement was the product of a preparation so patient and so complete that its culmination, when it came, would feel to those experiencing it less like the arrival of something that had been building for 1,000 years, and more like the sudden materialization of a darkness that had appeared from nowhere, which was the most precise possible expression of everything that the rule of two had been designed to achieve. And so the long tale settles into its own deep quiet, the way that all stories of genuine consequence settle when the last of their telling has been released into the air, and what remains is not the noise of event but the resonance of meaning, the soft persistent hum of something that has passed through you and left you changed in ways too gradual and too thorough to fully name. You have travelled tonight across a darkness so ancient that the stars themselves were young when it began, following a thread that wound from the first philosophical disagreements of beings who could touch the Force, all the way to the patient shadow of a man in a Senate chamber who had spent 1,000 years of preparation arriving at a single perfect moment of emergence. You have heard the oldest question the galaxy ever asked itself, which is the question of what power is for, and you have heard it asked and asked again across so many ages that the asking itself has become a kind of meditation, a rhythm as old as the force that moved through all of it. The darkness that the Sith carried was never simple. It was grief and pride and the particular hunger of beings who believed they had found something true. Let that complexity rest in you now, without judgment and without urgency. The Force is patient, and so, at last, are you. Let the darkness of good sleep receive you gently. The stars are very old tonight, and they are very still, and the watch is ended. Rest now.